All right, good to be with you. Let's see, we're recording now. I'll see if I can share the screen, get the right thing up. All right. So 2 weeks ago now, we looked at the resurrection narratives. That is really just chapter 20, and that's Mary Magdalene who comes to the tomb. Then she's the first to carry the gospel news, becomes the apostle of the apostles. We have that great little foot race between Peter and the beloved disciple, where, of course, the beloved disciple beats Peter because he always does. And then we had Thomas and his declaration, really the most important declaration in the gospel, my Lord and my God. He's the first person to finally realize who Jesus is, which is what we all know from the prologue, but he's the first one to really realize that. While he does doubt or at least question the resurrection, he is the first person to really understand and make the declaration. So today we get a glimpse of post-Easter. And what we can say unequivocally is that this moment, Thomas says, my Lord, my God, and then there's pretty much this line that says, and that's why we wrote this book. That's why I wrote this book, so that you might hear and believe that Jesus is Lord and God, right? And every single scholar will tell you that's the end of the book. That's the original version of John that ends at chapter 20. The only problem is we have never found a copy anywhere in the world of the Gospel of John ending just at chapter 20. They all have chapter 21 as part of it. So while all the scholars agree that was the original ending, we can't find us one to prove it. Instead, we get today's story, which is another glimpse of post-Easter. Jesus appeared to Thomas 1 week after the first Easter. So we know we're at least a week later. And it's basically divided up into 3 stories. 1 through 14 are a fishing story with the disciples. 15 through 19 is the story of Peter's restoration. It's really, those are combined. You usually heard those all read together. It's usually 1 through 19 is one story, but there's sort of 2 distinct parts of that story. And then you have the conclusion, the concluding story of the beloved disciple and the gospel as a whole, right, in those last 5 verses. So there's not a whole lot to it, but it's definitely worth looking at. So without further ado, we'll just jump straight in. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together with Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, well, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, no. He said to them, cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some. They cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple, whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, it is the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the lake. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. For they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised. So we mentioned last week, almost always say that the ends at 20, but we've never found one that ends there. So we have to look at 21, and it's part of this canon of Scripture. That is, we've always had it. So this is sometimes called an appendix. which I actually like. And it's almost certainly referencing the synoptic tradition. We've talked in the rest of the book, there's not really a reference to anything that the synoptics are talking about. This is pretty clearly one of those times where there is a reference. That is, for instance, Zebedee shows up often in the two sons of Zebedee, which are James and John. This is the first time the name Zebedee is ever used in the Gospel of John. So you have that reference to the Synoptic Gospels, but it's only here at the very end and in a sort of glancing way. For that matter, it's the first mention of fishing in the Gospel of John. They're at the water, they're at the Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Tiberias often, but there's never really a reference to anybody fishing. All those ideas of you will be fishers of men, that comes in the synoptics. I've heard lots of sermons and reflections on how the disciples decided to go back to what they knew, right? Peter went back to being a fisherman. He didn't know what to do after the resurrection. Well, it's a great way to tell the story, but the gospel, again, never mentions the professions of synoptics. Say they're fishers of men, and they each have this one story or another. They call narratives of Jesus saying, put down your nets on the other side of the boat, or keep fishing, and they have the miraculous catch. All of that stuff happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not in John. So you have all these echoes of the synoptic gospels immediately, but that's not in John, which is why, again, it's yet another way that people think that this was an extra story that was added on later. Peter is the one to decide. He's the one who says, I'm going fishing. He turns out he wants to go naked night fishing. No fisherman I know understands that. In no small part because, I've heard it said, people go, oh, well, you get hot when you're out in a boat and you take off your shirt. I was like, yeah, but that's not what it says. It says he was naked. And it says it was night and early morning, so that's not a time when it's real hot either, right? I mean, even in the Middle East, night is night and the temperatures are cooler. You're not taking off all your clothes in the boat with a bunch of other guys to go fishing. It's a weird turn of phrase. So again, then you just sort of have this classically bizarre story where the fish bite in the early morning. That's when you go fishing, right? And dawn. But then why does Peter have to put on clothes? Again, there's so many levels of this that are quirky. The catch is similar to those in the call narratives where they all have overflowing nets, but it's at the beginning of the ministry, not Easter. Now, some people will say then, well, this is echoing those call narratives, but saying that the work that the disciples have to do is now after Easter. Now they have to go do the work of really catching people. When they were working with Jesus, they didn't do that as much, but now that we're in the post-Easter world, it's our job to go and catch people. It's a nice read, but it's not necessarily in the gospel either, right? And then, of course, with the catch, as always, the beloved disciple is the first to recognize Jesus. And then Peter gets nervous naked, so he puts on his clothes to jump into the water to go see Jesus, who's only 100 yards from shore. It's pretty funny, but it's a pretty crazy move by Peter by any estimation, right? If you're that close to the shore and you have a whole bunch of fish, the natural thing would be to pull in the fish and then to take 15 minutes, 20 minutes to row the boat. Or if you're 100 yards away, it's not that long. Not that hard to get there at that point. Peter chooses to get clothed so he can jump in the water so he can go see Jesus. And the funny thing is, he's not recorded as hugging Jesus or talking to him or anything. He just sort of gets on the boat, runs to see Jesus, and then Jesus goes, hey, why don't y'all get some fish and we'll have breakfast? And so Peter then gets back on the boat to get the fish to bring it over to help Jesus. I think what we can say unequivocally about it, the one thing we can say just inside the text itself is that Peter is certainly anxious to see Jesus. We get that idea. And he's certainly excited about being with Jesus, but he's also not really sure what to do, right? Whether that's guilt from denying him or being unsure about what's coming next, he's just sort of there. So is also weird just because Peter's seen Jesus twice now, right? He saw him on Easter Day, and then he saw him with Thomas because they were all gathered there. So this is the third time he's seen Jesus, but it's, yeah, who knows? Peter's a little crazy. Two quick details. It lists a charcoal fire and then 153 fish. So we'll talk about those real quick. It's an anthracite coal fire. That's the same fire where Peter denied Jesus. If we recall, it's a very specific turn of phrase. It's not just charcoal, it's anthracite coal, which is actually a pretty rare form of coal that burns exceptionally hot. It's usually used by blacksmiths. Regardless, it's the probably the bigger thing is to say that Peter denied Jesus over an anthracite coal fire, which is setting up what comes next. 153 fish. No one really knows what this means, is the short answer. It's a really random and exact number. Some scholars in the 2nd century said it was the number of known fish in the world, species of fish, and they caught one of each, right? Nothing in the text says that. I don't know if that's an idea in the ancient world. There are some amazing math problems that people come up with that say like, oh, 153 is the number of known nations. 153 is the number accorded to Mary Magdalene if you count her letters out, her name out, and assign them to numbers in the Hebrew alphabet. All these kinds of nutty things, right? There's nothing that is definitive there, right? I'm sure the footnotes in your in the study Bibles will say something as well, but it's all guessing. And then finally, Jesus does cook breakfast, and he gives them bread and fish. Some want this to be a sort of communion moment, but Jesus doesn't do any of the things he does in the other Gospels, or what he even does in this book, and that is there's usually more of a fourfold movement, as Dom Gregory Dix would say. That is, Jesus gives thanks, breaks the bread, and gives it to those gathered, right? That's the sort of movement that he takes, gives thanks, breaks the bread, and shares it. He doesn't do any of that in this moment. He just cooks breakfast and hands it to them. And additionally, there's not wine, which is helpful because I think fewer folks would want a communion that's fish and crackers. A little less enticing, I think, less communion. If that's what this is supposed to be, then I think that would go as well. Come forward and get your cod and your cracker would probably not go over quite the same way as bread and wine. Let's say. What else do we hear? There's a whole lot of interesting details, but gosh, unlike a lot of other stories that John tells, there's not clarity around them, right? Not that, oh, it was dark and oh, they came to the light, and the sort of symbolic conversation isn't there. Neither is the detail conversation. What else do y'all hear?
Well, it's interesting that Nathaniel was there.
Yes.
I mean, if I recall, he was the one that Jesus talked about. I saw you under the fig tree.
That's right.
So we know that he's presumably the rabbinic scholar, or at least was studying with rabbinic scholars. But I don't think had he appeared in the gospel since then?
No, he's just at the beginning and here at the very end. And he's only listed, 99% sure, he's only listed in John. Not one listed as a disciple in the other. So yeah, there's a lot there about Nathaniel showing up again, right?
The footnotes in my study Bible, comment that this service, Jesus' service of the food, the cooking and serving the fish and the bread, are a continuation of the service from the foot washing.
Right. Yes, there's definitely that idea of service in the midst of it.
There, the only comment on the footnote about the Peter putting on his clothes to jump in the lake. says simply, neither nakedness nor working clothes are suitable for the presence of the Lord.
Fair enough. Yeah. Who knows? It's definitely it's just such a weird turn, like whole sequence there that I'm sure is symbolic, and maybe the community when it was written understood it, but it is lost to time now if there is a clear understanding, right? If it was sort of a baptismal moment, because of course in the ancient world for baptism, you would get completely naked. Baptism was always naked, and then you would put on a new white robe to symbolize your new life. Like you would take off all your old clothes in the old world, and then you would have get baptized, and then you would have a new robe to put on. And yes, they separated. It was not everybody gathered for to watch that moment. Everybody would. The men would go in one room for the men to be baptized, and the women in another for the women to be baptized. But yes.
Okay, that's good. Oh my gosh.
But even then, it doesn't make sense because he puts on clothes before he jumps into the water, right? It makes
Right.
If he was naked and jumped in and then grabbed clothes when he got on the beach, then okay, maybe, but he's putting on clothes to jump in the water, so it doesn't make sense in the baptismal kind of imagery. Yeah. All right. We'll keep going.
Well, I guess that it may be noteworthy that Jesus. It says Jesus stood on the beach, and it prefaces that with just after daybreak. So we do get a little bit of the the light was just returning.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something there. I do love the fact that all the disciples don't ask if it's Jesus because they know it's him. But why would you say that if you knew it was him? Right? There's that sort of weird, no one dared ask, is this the Lord? Because they knew it was the Lord. Well, then what? That's like saying like, no, I knew exactly what that was. Weird. It's a weird, again, sort of turn of phrase there where you go, then did you know who Jesus was, or did you not know who Jesus was?
Wondering what was so different about him, because there are other times when they do not recognize him at first.
Yeah, that's a fairly constant feature of the post-resurrection occurrances.
It is. I mean, he's just a man. They don't, they don't really recognize that it's Jesus. So I keep thinking, what did he look like? What was so different after the resurrection? But we don't know.
We don't know. I think the best argument I've heard about the sort of resurrected Jesus and why he would look different is because he is perhaps relaxed. He's not carrying the burdens of the world in the same way that he was when he was doing his ministry and knew the crucifixion was to come. So perhaps he's just a more relaxed, not as intense, or because he is actually united to God in a new and different way, right? There's something about that written part of Jesus that is fully connected with God that gives him a different appearance, a more peaceful, beatific appearance, right? But I don't know. All right, well, we'll look at the second half of the story. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow." Breakfast is over. Jesus turns and asks Peter if he loves him. And again, we should be completely unsurprised by what happens, because again, we're once again at an anthracite fire, coal fire. It's burning just like the one was when Peter denied him. So of course, we should expect that there's going to be those threefold rejection is now mended with the threefold acceptance. So while the connections about the fishing stories leap over the synoptics, this is 100% within the text, right? This literally, Peter denied him 3 times around that anthracite coal fire. Here we are with Peter being brought back into the fold again. And it's very much in keeping both with that story as well as this idea of the good shepherd, right? Go and feed my sheep, tend my sheep, feed my lambs. All of this is caught up in the language of John. So while the first half of the story seems to be almost dropped out of the blue, this one is very much in keeping with John and his both intentional and cryptic kind of responses, I would say. And of course, God bless Peter. He's so dense, he still doesn't get it. Even though it's literally, it should be the same fire, similar fire, same smell, with Jesus in front of him asking him over and over again, "Do you love me?" Peter still doesn't even get that he's getting forgiven, right? He gets offended. The other thing that's fascinating is Jesus does not refer to him as Peter. He refers to him as Simon, right? It's always this very personal Simon, son of John. You're not the rock right now. I want to talk to you as Simon, as the person that I called into ministry in the first place, versus Peter, the leader of the church, Peter, the rock of the church, Peter. So it's this powerful kind of concept, but it's exactly like our baptism, right? We have the threefold denial and the threefold affirmation. I think it's one of the more powerful reflections people and connections that people rightfully make here. It definitely informs our baptism. We deny evil 3 times, and then we affirm Jesus is Lord 3 times in our baptismal covenant. We become part of our faith community. So we deny evil, then we affirm God in Christ 3 times. And this service is actually patterned. If you didn't know this, our baptismal service is patterned after an ancient Roman model of adoption. You had to deny your old family 3 times and then affirm your new family 3 times. That was how you adopted the legal aspect of the Roman model of adoption. And so our baptism very much is that adoption into Christ, into faith. That's taking it a little bit outside of what is meant, I think, for just this threefold affirmation, but it's definitely this idea that Peter's being forgiven, even if Peter's. So it's not a perfect line, but this is how it works, right? The story concludes with the prediction of Peter's death. Actually, let's pause there before we go to the death. Other thoughts about the affirmation? People make a deal. I don't know that there is something to understand there about why Jesus says, "Go and feed my lambs, then tend my sheep, then feed my sheep." I don't know if there's a difference in those 3 things other than just a turn of phrase, but there might
be. My Bible stresses the fact that he denied him 3 times and he's given the 3 opportunities to affirm him.
Right. Yeah.
And I know they said the instructions sound very similar, but I guess it's just the fact that Jesus is doing this 3 times because he denied him 3 times.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I didn't realize though that was part of our affirmation, that it was 3 times. So.
Yeah.
And you neither did you. Neither one of us had made that connection.
Right.
I think I once read or heard that they're in the three questions that that Jesus asks, that they're the first two times the word for love he uses is philios, and the second and the third time it's agape. Is that right?
I think so. Let me look up. I'll have to look at the Greek real quick. But yeah, I mean, I think there is that idea within it, but I'd have to look at the.
So he starts with these sort of brotherly love notions, and then the third one is this more self-giving,
right,
which may be related to Jesus moves on from that to speak the sentences that sort of presage Peter's giving up his life.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's say this always takes a minute because it's always really when you have Greek English interlinears, what is like 2 sentences becomes a whole page. So the first time, he says agape the first time. Jesus says agape the first time. And then Peter responds with philios. So it's philios. Then a second time he says agape, and the third time he says philios in response. And then verse 17. Oh, Jesus changes the third time and says, okay, are you fond of me then? And Peter says, I am fond of you. That philios, which they're translating in this particular version as fond. So Jesus goes from agape to philios.
That's interesting.
Yeah. All right, so the other thing that we'll look at then is just this prediction of Peter's death, that he's going to be led away by a rope. Scholars point to Peter's being arrested and led away in chains, where he was eventually crucified. I think it makes perfect sense. The interesting thing is to note, or that we're not sure of, right? But it certainly sounds this way. It sounds like this is a story written after Peter has been crucified. Has this feeling that it might have been written afterwards, and they know that, mainly because of the stuff that comes next. But regardless, Jesus makes it clear what Peter should do next, which is follow me. Right? So Jesus has forgiven him, brought him back into the fold. You're gonna be martyred on my behalf, most likely. But here's the key: what do you do next, Peter? Just follow me. Just follow me. And all of you should know exactly what that word is in Greek. Does anybody know what the Greek word for follow me is?
No.
Every Sunday just about, but you didn't realize it. What does follow me mean? Acolyte. Okay.
Okay.
Acolyte is to follow. One follows. So, and in some ways, Peter is certainly an apostle, but he is at the core, and what we all are as core is really acolytes more than we are ones who follow. So there you go. Those words that we use in our church all the time, but no one ever realizes what they mean. Sort of like Eucharist and rector and all these other terms we love. But akalutheo is the root word for acolyte. All right, so with all that in mind, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." The rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony. There are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. After this majestic book, focusing relentlessly on the divinity of Jesus and the action of saving the world, the second ending sort of goes out with a whimper. We could write a lot more books about this. It's not quite the same as saying, I wrote this, Thomas saying, my Lord and my God, and then, and we wrote this book so that you might hear and believe, right? That was the whole idea for that first ending. This one is a little bit more, well, Jesus said that he would be here when he comes back. Well, he didn't say that he'd be alive, just that he could be if Jesus wanted him to be. Maybe not. I mean, it's sort of a weird backing in. So Peter, as usual, gets jealous of the beloved disciple. Jesus claims he can do what he wants, but that's not what Jesus meant. That's sort of that exchange here. It's just a strange way to conclude the book. Everything else that's happened. Certainly, again, you have this idea that perhaps Peter has already died when the book is written because of the way this part of the story is told, right? That the beloved disciple absolutely wrote this story according to this ending. And you can trust him, and he's trustworthy. And so he's probably still alive and Peter is dead, but people are like, well, but he's getting old. You almost have this idea that maybe that disciple is getting older, or things are changing, or they're not like, well, are you going to be alive when he comes back? And the disciple himself seems unsure, right? So it's a weird sort of in between conversation there. So again, while we have this beautiful moment where Jesus not just forgives Peter, but brings him back into the fold, and you have this echoes of fish in the majority of this chapter just doesn't. Rhetoric of light and life are missing. The clear declarations that Jesus is God and extraordinary aren't present. It just feels like a tacked on story. Said, what else do we hear here in these concluding verses? Feel free to redeem the final chapter of John.
Real comments on
There's
that.
no real commentary at the end of the book.
No, most of the commentaries even are sort of like, okay.
They don't have a comment about that particular part.
Certainly not about that sort of prediction that the beloved disciple will live forever or live until Jesus returns, which of course at 2,000 years, he'd be quite an old chap if he's running around waiting.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, all of the Gospels, if you're reading any of the Gospels and certainly Paul's letters, you get the same idea. Anything in the New Testament is very clear. Jesus is coming back in the next week, as far as they were concerned. It was not going to be, none of them had any idea or concept that we would be at 2,000 years and going, right? That was just not in the understanding of the disciples or the early faith communities. They thought Jesus was coming back very, very soon. So then I'll ask the overarching questions. What did you like about John's Gospel? Anything surprising about John's Gospel? Or what did you not like about it? We've read the whole book and talked about it.
Yep.
Thinking back.
Makes you think a good bit about what some of this all truly means, I think. I mean, it's interesting to me that when you look at the 40 days after the resurrection, before the ascension. The only place this really appears is in John, right?
Yeah.
So why did the others not say anything?
All the Gospels are pretty clear. Apart from Luke says he's trying to give us an orderly account and give us everything. But Mark and Matthew and John all are pretty clear that they're not telling everything, especially when you read this ending of the book of John, right? That he says, oh, we could have written a lot more, but this is the main stuff so that you would believe in Jesus. I always get the idea, he's like, I mean, I could have told you what he had for lunch on Thursday, but that's not real interesting. Like that they intentionally picked and chose stories that were the greatest hits versus an exhaustive, detailed account of everything Jesus did every day of his ministry and life. And they all seem to be pretty unapologetic about that, really. That's the point of this story, is so that you can understand who Jesus was and the important stuff about him, because I've got a limited amount of time to tell you. So if they cut something, I'm pretty sure if we could interview the gospel writers, they would all say like, well, I didn't need to tell that story. It didn't fit with what I was trying to tell, right? They would not say it doesn't matter, but they would just say, well, I was wanting to focus more on something different, right? Like any preacher or teacher for any class. I mean, we could have talked about that part, but I decided to skip it.
Right.
It's interesting that he covers some things the others don't, and then they cover things that John doesn't.
Absolutely.
So there's a real mishmash there of miracles and acts and discussions that you really, when you put them all together, I think it cements the message better, but it's not in some of the other gospels. I mean, it's interesting to me, like where he goes to Jerusalem for the second Passover, heals a lame man. That's in John, but it's not in any of the other three gospels, which that's during the Galilean ministry. I just think it's interesting how he picks up some things the others don't.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about John's gospel, I don't know how well I can describe it, but it's sort of the mystical approach that, what Jesus' ministry was about is teaching and showing people how to be in relationship with God. And it's sort of like nothing else really counts. That there is this life that you live, in the world, but what you do in your relationship with God and sort of seeking unity, with the Father is is what life should be about.
Absolutely.
At least that's what I take from it.
I like it. Yes, I agree.
And really, I can see, in the synoptics that in a way you can read a lot of what Jesus says in the synoptics and see, well, really, I get the feeling from time to time that, that's really where Jesus was headed, but sometimes those gospel writers didn't necessarily see it that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. Or either Jesus wasn't as sure about it, or the gospel writers, are both, right? in all three of the synoptics. Which is why sometimes they'll say, actually it's often said, that the Gospel of John is the theology of the church, right? That the others might have the stories, but this is really, who is Jesus Christ? We'll read the Gospel of John. That's the one that really tells you who he is, because it's not as clear in the other three about who is this guy. It's the messianic secret, and it's the unsureness of it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting to speculate whether at least the first 20 chapters of the Gospel of John were written by people who had read the synoptics.
Right.
I mean, it seems like it would be likely so, but it's as if, to me, it's that the gospel writer has said, okay, I know what else is out there. I know these other stories, but I want to tell this story, in a way that really shows what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
In the other books written during that time, because I know the church sat down and read a bunch of them, and then gave us 4 that we keep in our Bible today. Are there any other books that fill in holes in what we believe here that might be looked at?
Well, sure. I mean, they didn't set the canon of Scripture wasn't set until Nicaea, which is what, 325. So you have a good 250, 300 years of people writing stories about Jesus and telling stories about Jesus. And so there are other gospels floating out there. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the famous ones that's more just a list of sayings. And then there are some of these other stories that largely they usually call the Gnostic Gospels, that tell stories, but a lot of those have been discredited over the centuries by some of the earliest believers. And that includes the Gospel of Thomas. There are a number of references to some of the early church fathers saying that's a waste of time gospel and it's made up and stuff like that. And so you have this back and forth. I mean, it's really, to a certain degree, I wouldn't say it's fake news in the sort of current parlance of our society, but it's not unlike that conversation. Like, well, which one's the real story? Oh, well, they're just making that up. We're the real story over here. And no, Mark really knew what he was talking about, but that Thomas gospel, that's dumb. And, there's the Gospel of Mary. And there's a similar kind of comment around the Gospel of Mary that one is a late comer and does not have real knowledge of Jesus. And they were going back and forth about which one it really had the truth about Jesus, and they landed on these 4, right? So the church made a specific choice to go with these 4. And largely from what we can read and understand, piecing it back together, it was because they felt like these were the most authentic to who Jesus was and to what the church understood about the ministry of Jesus. That said, there's lots of conversation and debate about why some of the others, like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas and all these different ones, aren't included, and if they could help us fill in and know a little bit more about Jesus. But it's really the hardest part for not just any of the ones we've discounted, but also for these is, well, which of these was the literal, like they just had no concept in the ancient world of telling a story that was factually, literally correct. That is something that the modern world has created much more than the ancient world was ever concerned about. They were happy to sort of conflate myth and story together because they understood you were getting to a deeper meaning. And so if you read like the story of the birth of Julius Caesar, there's all these stories about him, and we used to do it, right? I mean, before we start pointing out things that are too crazy, we can talk about Julius Caesar, was born and he immediately defeated I think it was a serpent or something. He beat in the crib, right, to prove that he was going to overcome evil. But we can laugh about that, but it's the same difference as when we say, killed him a bar when he was only 3, Davy Crockett, right? I mean, that's the same. It has been throughout history that we tell some stories about people that we know Davy Crockett did not kill him a bar when he was only 3. That talks about how he was a strong mountain man, right? Or that, I cannot tell a lie, and the cherry tree, right? Everyone says that's a made-up story. Probably George Washington himself would say it was a made-up story. But we tell those stories to try and get to a larger truth about the person that story is told about. And that's not to demythologize the gospel at all, but it's to say that it's really, really hard for us to say which of this was a literal factual story and exactly the way something happened. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon and, on the shore of Tiberias near this landing and all that kind of stuff. They didn't report that way. That's just not what they were concerned about. It was much more, well, no, he fed 5,000 people. It was a miraculous feeding. It was an amazing moment, and people remembered that moment. But there's never an idea of, was this purely, out of thin air? Was this because everybody chose to share what they had, and it turned out people had more than enough? All those kinds of questions that we ask miss the point of the writers, which is usually to say, no, this Jesus guy is exceptional, right? There was something extraordinary about this person, and who was this person? And how much of God was he? The church says 100% God and 100% man, and I'm comfortable with that. But it's just to say that this is where all of these conversations get really difficult, because again, we don't tell the stories today in the same way they tell them then.
I mean, it's like in this story today, Jesus tells them, cast the net on the right side.
Right.
And they get 153 fish, and it's so many they can't even pull them all in. And it's just to say, following Jesus leads to the abundant life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, any fisherman would probably say, man, Jesus that's real helpful. Fish on the right side of the boat. Wow, I didn't try casting off the other side of the boat before this, right? I mean, of course they cast their nets on their nets every side of the boat. That's what fishermen do, right? And again, it's not that literal, the right side of the boat is the best side of the boat to fish off of. It's that the symbolism and understanding there's an abundance in Christ. Yeah. Absolutely. All right, my friends. Well, good stuff. It's been good. It's been good to talk about John.